after he wrote this letter to Danbury Baptist, 1 year afterwards, he signed a bill to use tax revenue to support a priest going to minister to the Kaskaskia Indians.
The treaty that he's speaking of with the Kaskaskia Indians involved the United States government buying nearly 9 million acres from these Indians. They were part of the Illinois Indians. Their population had dwindled significantly. They were selling land to the U.S. government. It was common in these treaties, buying land, for Indian tribes to specify how they wished to receive the payment. For example, 1807 treaty with the Cherokee specified, in addition to the $10,000, that they also received a grist mill and a machine for cleaning cotton and a $100 annual stipend for their tribal chief for life. That was not unusual. This is what was happening with the Kaskaskia Indians. They had been converted over 100 years earlier to Catholicism. They specified they wanted part of the payment for this 9 million acres to go toward building a church and paying for a priest. That's all it is.
Just 2 days after Thomas Jefferson wrote that letter on January 1st to the Danbury Baptist, on January 3rd, 1802, he attended a worship service that was being held in the Capitol building, a worship service that he authorized. In fact, I've gone to the Capitol, I've seen his signature on the attendance roster. He was there on January the 3rd, 1802. It was Thomas Jefferson, who believed in the separation of church and state, who authorized the use of the Capitol for the founding of the first Christian church in Washington, D.C. And that church met there for decades and decades and decades, and Jefferson attended there.
Washington had not been the capital for very long. They had only 2 small church buildings at the time Jefferson was president, and before he took the oath of office, they began using the House of Representative chambers for church services to accommodate the fact that the new capital had very few buildings and only 2 small church buildings for church services. This wasn't the only public building used to hold church services, and Jefferson did attend, though he did not authorize it, and this was not the first church in the city. This temporary accommodation, unfortunately, turned into a decade-long practice of using government buildings for churches. This kind of abuse continues to be a problem today. When some churches rent space in public buildings, like any other nonprofit, they sometimes get sweetheart deals because they're a church, and have been known sometimes to go for months or years without paying rent. This is why we need separation of church and state. The fact that they allowed a temporary accommodation at that time when the capital had very little in the way of church buildings is no excuse to allow this kind of mixture of church and state today.
Never did the founders believe that this amendment would be used to restrict religious freedom. This was to protect religious freedom.
What the Danbury Baptist understood, and Jefferson understood, and Roger Williams understood, is that preventing the government from promoting religion is part of religious freedom. You're not free religiously if the government insists on promoting one religion over another, just like you try to mislead us about saying that children weren't allowed to pray when, in fact, the schools, the public schools, were not allowed to make prayer part of the official school day.
Not only listen to the writings and the words of our founding fathers, look at the early court rulings. These court rulings not only show that the nation was founded on a Christian foundation, but in many cases, government was encouraged to support the Christian faith. For example, consider the case of Runkle versus Weinmiller in 1799. Now, remember, 1799 is 7 years after the ratification of the First Amendment and the no establishment of a religion clause. In 1799, the Supreme Court of Maryland said in its decision, quote, "By our form of government, the Christian religion is the established religion."
As I've addressed before, the First Amendment and all of the rights therein were preceded by Congress shall make no law. The federal government had to respect these rights. State governments did not. So in a state that had an official state religion, which he's mentioned before, they could fully ignore the First Amendment, and they did.
Now think about it. 7 years after the ratification of the First Amendment, this court says we have an established religion. It is the Christian religion. What is wrong with those imbeciles? Weren't they aware of the First Amendment? Of course they were aware of it. They understood it better than you do or I do.
Yes, they did understand the First Amendment better than you do. Not only did they understand the difference between what applied to the federal government and the state government, but Jeffress would do well to remember that James Madison, who wrote this amendment, and in his detached memoranda, he stated his opposition to congressional and military chaplains as being a violation of the First Amendment. Jefferson also took this position.
The First Amendment is about protecting religious expression, not about restricting religious expression.
And the Establishment Clause is necessary to achieve that goal.
Now, second case, Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States, 1892. This Supreme Court case had to deal with a church that was being sued by the government because it hired a minister from England and therefore violated federal immigration law.
He's just emphasized a state court ruling a few years after the founding so as to make it appear that this is the opinion of the founders. But in order to get that to apply to federal law, he's had to go more than 100 years after the founding to this ruling.
So the government sues the church for violating immigration laws. The Supreme Court rejected that suit against the church. And the court went on, showing the evidence that this nation was founded on Christian principles. And then they said this, quote, "These and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation," end of quote.
So were these judges, more than 100 years after the Constitution, right in asserting that it's a Christian nation? Well, there are some interesting rulings that have occurred since then that disagree with that basic idea. For example, moderate to conservative judges like Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy have disagreed with this ruling. But more than that, the two most conservative judges in recent years, William Rehnquist and Antonin Scalia, have ruled or written to that effect, that this is an improper ruling. Scalia called that ruling nothing but an invitation to judicial lawmaking. This was judges putting their personal agenda ahead of the law, and that's coming from not those liberal judges he dislikes, but conservative judges, because that's what they did. They ignored the law, the First Amendment, applying to the federal government, and replaced it with their idea that a church should be immune to the law. Well, these judges aren't the only people who disagree with this ruling. On Fox News, November 2017, Dr. Robert Jeffress went on Fox News and stated that, in fact, churches do have to obey immigration law. They are not above the law. So apparently Dr. Jeffress disagrees with the ruling, but he simply wants to pull out the ruling itself as a way of showing that here we have some judges using the term Christian nation, even though conservative judges since then have said that's not what the Constitution says. And it certainly wasn't what early courts said about the federal government somehow being able to ignore the Establishment Clause.
This is a Christian nation, the Supreme Court said. Pastor Jeffress says this is a Christian nation. The Supreme Court in that 1892 case reached back to support its ruling to a case from 1811, the People versus Ruggles. This was a New York Supreme Court case. I want you to listen, this is fascinating too. The New York Supreme Court said this: "Nor are we bound by any expressions in the Constitution, as some have strangely supposed, either not to punish at all or to punish indiscriminately the like attacks upon the religion of Muhammad, that's Islam, or of the Grand Lama, that is Buddhism. And for this plain reason, that the case assumes that we are a Christian people. And the morality of the country is deeply engrafted upon Christianity and not upon the doctrines of worship of those imposters. Can you believe that? The United States Supreme Court terms Islam and Buddhism as imposter religions.
No, they did not. As you stated earlier, it was the New York State Supreme Court at a time when the First Amendment, including freedom of speech, only applied to the federal government. And the words of that Supreme Court, the state of New York, only make sense if you know that this is about blasphemy. Here's what they said. Ruggles, speaking in a loud voice in a crowded tavern in Salem, New York, said, Jesus Christ was a bastard and his mother must be a whore. So, is this what he has in store for us? Are we going to have blasphemy laws that protect only the Christian religion and you can blaspheme against other religions as you see fit? And this isn't just about religion. In fact, it really isn't about separation of church and state in this particular ruling. It's about free speech. Do you have the right to say this? And apparently, if Jeffress gets his way, blasphemy laws will return. I don't know if Jeffress misspoke when he said this was a United States Supreme Court ruling instead of a New York Supreme Court ruling. However, he has repeatedly ignored the difference between federal and state court rulings and is doing it deliberately. His entire Christian nation theme evaporates when he cannot obscure this difference.